Interesting, because you brought up something about I hate men earlier too. In general, we should never defend using slurs, racial slurs, as pejoratives at people. I think that's a pretty consistent thing, and I don't think I get into any trouble with that position. Like, I don't think somebody can be in a situation like, well, what about this, Destiny? Shouldn't you be able to say a racial slur there? As a pejorative? No, I don't think so. But if we start doing like some are allowed and some aren't, there are so many weird areas we get in when it comes to like slurs for Jewish people, slurs for Chinese people in China, like mixed race people, what slurs are they? Like, it just gets so weird and crazy, and then individuals are gonna be really unhappy. If a white person is unhappy being called cracker, I think that's fair. If somebody's unhappy because they can't use a racial slur at somebody, I don't think that that's as fair. I don't really give as much credence to their, I agree 1,000,000%. But I don't think most people have the same perspective, or they'll say they do, but they won't actually. Like, could you imagine getting like a 45, 50-year-old person to go to therapy because they have like negative feelings about black people?
I'm a YouTuber and a TikToker, if anyone doesn't know what I do. I'm like a commentary type guy. I do like a lot of comedy-based stuff, so that's sort of where I'm coming from. But
okay,
I guess I just wanted to like talk out like your thoughts on the whole thing.
Yeah, do you want me to just go?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
I think that there can be times where racial slurs are funny. I'm not like a big like we should ban all racial slurs kind of guy. That's not who I am personally. But I think it gets a little bit weird when some people are so adamantly opposed to certain racial slurs, literally divorced of context, but then are willing to kind of like defend racial slurs against white people. It feels like a very bad position optically, and then even like intellectually, it seems almost impossible to defend. But yeah, I think it's like a pretty common sense, like this is probably not a good idea. Let's not defend this particular type of thing, you know?
Yeah, I guess my perspective on it is like I definitely disagree with the people on the left that say that it isn't a slur, because like definitionally it definitely is a slur, because you're insulting someone for like an immutable characteristic, as you were mentioning. But I guess my perspective is like I've always seen that like the reason slurs are like a really bad thing is because of the power behind them. Like, would you disagree on that?
I would agree on that, but I think that the power behind them that's going to be the subject of the conversation. I don't know if you want to explain it or if you want me to shortcut that at all.
Yeah, I mean, like, because if you have a slur against someone that doesn't have like any sort of systemic power behind it, then in my opinion, that's just like a rude, mean insult. And like at that point, like I don't necessarily think that like using rude, mean insults is something like we should be doing, but I would argue that like, for example, insulting someone for like being short, I would say would like possibly do more harm than like insulting someone for being white, because like there are actually times where short people have like systemic disadvantages and like white people really don't usually have systemic disadvantages.
So the way that I typically approach this kind of conversation is I agree to some extent, but what I argue is I don't think individuals experience systems. I think that like systems clash with systems, and an individual can have an experience like inside of a system, but I don't think an individual can experience an entire system. So when we start talking about like some word can or cannot have power because of systems, I think that words are said at like an individual level, and I think that they're felt at an individual level, and then I think when we start assuming that individuals can experience an entire system or an entire class, I think that academically maybe it feels like a good argument, but on Earth, or like when we look at individual humans, people don't interpret things that way.
Yeah, I don't think a person can like experience a system, but I think the way the system is set up can influence the amount of harm that a certain word does. And I think that like calling someone who is in a more disadvantaged position a slur can also help perpetuate that negative system, whereas calling someone a slur who's in like a privileged position wouldn't do that as much.
So I kind of agree with this, but I would kind of look at the overall climate of where are we at in public discourse, and I think I would actually use that system or power thing to say, okay, maybe this is a reason then why we shouldn't be doing this anymore. It seems to be the case that this kind of like anti-white discourse where it used to be kind of like a meme like 5 years ago, definitely 10 years ago. But I would say that over the past like year, it's become a lot more normalized to just outwardly and blatantly shit on white people, and everybody just kind of sees it as like funny and acceptable and humorous. But as our political climate gets more and more divisive, I think that we are now in a case where you can legitimately be made to feel like alienated or feel otherized because you're white, and that's become an acceptable thing. And I think we should push back on that is kind of what I'm looking like. Like 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 40 years ago, calling somebody a cracker is like, who the fuck cares? Like these days on social media, you can legitimately have people like saying things like, we need to kill all white people. And it's like, that's kind of insane. And there's not really like a public pushback from it. Sometimes you'll get banned because of TOS, but nobody really talks about it because we always hear that saying like, well, systemic. And it's like, well, okay, I don't know if individuals feel that way though.
Do you think there's like a legitimate push by people on the left that they actually do have like eugenics viewpoints, or think that like people who aren't white are like genetically superior to white people? Or like, what do you think? Because to me, I have always just seen it as a kind of a meme, like you're saying. I guess I haven't noticed this big systemic shift necessarily, because in my opinion, like, I would agree if there's someone who is like a legitimate like black supremacist or something who legitimately believes that like the black race is superior and they're going around calling people cracker, I would say like that's a bad thing and they shouldn't be doing that. But if it is something where I like, from my perspective, it seems like the most people are just like, the majority of people are just kind of memeing it still, you know?
Yeah, so that's where I was basically. So I don't know how familiar with my stuff, but like 4 or 5, I'd say like 2 or 3 years ago, I used to use like the white jokes a lot because I thought they were funny. Like, oh my God, that's white, you're white as fuck. Like stuff like this would really trigger the fuck out of people. And I thought it was funny. But I think with like most forms of racial humor, I started to find it less funny when it felt like people legitimately started to feel that way. So you mentioned like black nationalism or black supremacy. It feels like as far as social media goes, you can find a lot of defense for people that are black nationalists, and even some defense, not as much, but some defense for people that are black supremacists. And you get into this weird world where like these people have a space and they can have conversations and we're supposed to understand them and why they exist. But like if it was ever a white supremacist, like the obvious answer is immediately like, this person is horrible and we don't accept this at all, and you know, this is like not somebody that we should ever tolerate. So I think that feels a little bit strange.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It can be hard to like know the motivation behind like why someone is saying something. But I think that sometimes like when people of color do like lash out and use slurs, it's like because they're upset with racism that they've experienced. So if they're like, oh, I hate white people because they're so racist towards me, that would be different than like, oh, I hate white people because we need to cleanse the world of white people or something, you know?
Yeah, so the problem with that is that like there's two huge problems with that. On one end, it kind of like dehumanizes minorities, in my opinion, because it's like, oh, well, sometimes if you're a minority and you have a problem with a white person, you just can't help it but be racist. That's kind of like it's this old conservative argument of like the bigotry of low expectations. And a second problem that I have with that is that can justify the use of the N-word as well. Like, let's say that you have a white person and they were robbed by 2 black people like 3 times. Like, would anybody ever use that excuse? We're like, okay, well, come on. He's had a ton of bad experiences with black people. Like, of course he's going to call him the N-word sometimes. Like, we have to be compassionate, you know? I don't think we would ever use that excuse for a white person using a racial slur.
Well, I think that the reason why you wouldn't is because it would add to the systemic issue if a white person is calling them that, but it doesn't necessarily add to a systemic issue in the other direction.
Yeah, but do we feel that? Does that feel fair as individuals? Like, are we ever going to expect an individual to interpret that system as that? Like, okay, I understand, like, you can be racist against me because of systemic stuff, but I can't be racist towards you because of systemic stuff. Like, that just, it feels like on an individual level, no person would ever interpret it that way.
I think the whole argument online of like individual racism, it feels like it's just such a semantic argument, because some people are like, oh, you can't be racist towards white people because racism implies like privilege and power, but then you can be prejudiced towards white people. But I'm like, if you legitimately like hate someone because they're white, like that feels like that would be racism, you know?
Mm-hmm. But a lot of people would challenge you these days, kids in university or people in social media would challenge even that individual argument. And they'd say, no, you can't individually be racist against a white person. I think that's how far the definitions have gone.
I feel like you have to view things on like an individual and a systemic level, like at the same time. I feel like if you focus so much on like just the individual argument or so much on the systemic argument, you can get like lost in the weeds, because like on an individual level, I think like insulting someone because they're short, insulting someone because of their skin color, insulting someone for anything like that is cringe and like stupid. But I do think you have to also think about the systemic implications at the same time.
I mean, like I think they're good to keep in mind, but I would never ask an individual to keep that in mind, because oftentimes individuals aren't even the inheritors, because like we view class and oppression and privilege, all of this stuff is like highly intersectional, right? So I don't know where you like politically, so maybe you'll disagree with this, but like I would say that in the United States, you're going to be way better off being born into like a very rich black family than you are into a very poor white family. That money in the United States is a really, really big driver for your success in life.
I think that's probably generally the case. I think that's not going to always be the case. I think there could be a case where a rich black person still has to deal with like a lot of racism.
Yeah, you might,
like that,
but they don't have to deal with being poor, which is one of the shittiest parts of the black experience: lack of household wealth and families.
And one of the problems I have with like the slurs against white people is a lot of them are based on like classism. So when there are like
redneck,
rich
hillbilly,
when there are rich white people who are like super academic and are like, we should totally be able to say all the slurs against white people, but then they could be not realizing that like cracker, hillbilly, redneck all have like classist undertones at the same time.
Yeah, so I kind of I don't think that an individual. So if we agree that white privilege exists, which I largely do, I'm not going to sit here and try to tell somebody that's born in a trailer park that they have white privilege, because that privilege, even if there is some point in their life where they access it somehow, is going to be completely invisible to that person. They're not going to be aware of that at all, right?
Yeah, I think the word privilege has this connotation of like that you're gaining something from it. But in my perspective, it's like privilege is that you aren't losing anything from it, you know?
I mean, it could be a gain, it could be a loss. It might be that you have the gain of like people give you respect, but you might view that in a different light, in that, well, at least people aren't disrespecting you, something like that, basically, right? When it comes to a job application or a school application, or the way that people treat you, or police pulling you over, or...
Yeah, well, the thing I'm saying is like poor white people are totally very disadvantaged in a lot of ways, but they aren't usually going to be disadvantaged because they're white.
True.
And generally poor black people would be more disadvantaged than poor white people, I would say.
Sure, but that privilege, if we have an honest analysis of that privilege and the way that that system works, that's probably going to vary from area to area, you know? Sometimes I think white people in the United States make the mistake of saying black people have a shared experience in the US. African Americans, the descendants of slaves, definitely do, but a black immigrant from Nigeria coming over here with a PhD is not necessarily going to have the same experience as somebody born in, you know, the hood, fucking Detroit or some shit, or like in a ghetto or a project, right? These are going to have way different experiences. So I think that we have to be really careful sometimes when we talk about like white privilege and black privilege. I think that they're fine terms to have, and I think that it's okay to use these when we analyze things. But when it comes down to the analysis of the unit of the individual, to say, hey, you're white, you have white privilege, and this guy has like, you know, like a crack addicted family and he lives in the Midwest, and you know, there's like a meth lab in his basement. I don't know if he's going to connect or jive with that argument, and I wouldn't expect him to.
Sure, I definitely see the argument that especially like rich classist, like liberals or left-leaning people could alienate people by, you know, saying, oh, you have white privilege when like they're super poor, and then like it's basically you're just being classist at that point.
Which I think
definitely see.
Sorry, go ahead.
I definitely see that argument. And yeah, I mean, you could say that there is no white experience or black experience on an individual level, but I think any culture works in a way where no one person is going to have the exact same experience of what it means to be an American, but we can still all say like we have the experience of what it is to be an American, you know?
For sure. I agree with that. So like if somebody would ask me like, could the class of black people exercise racist power against the class of white people? That's almost always going to be no. Maybe in exceedingly rare circumstances, that's almost always going to be no, because in terms of wealth, representation, power, influence, white people tend to sit higher on that hierarchy than black people as a class. But when it comes to the individual, can an individual or group of black people exert racism over an individual or group of white people? Well, that answer is almost certainly going to be yes. And when we talk about like insults, like cracker, insult, like the class of white people or the class of black people aren't insulting each other. It comes down to the unit of the individual is levying that insult. In which case, I think that it's probably just something we probably should never say is okay. Even if a class is ahead of another class, it doesn't mean an individual inherits everything from said class and then can therefore wield that power in an insulting or destructive manner as a result of that.
Yeah, I do agree that things get complicated once you try to analyze it from an intersectional perspective, and that there's all the sort of intersecting identities that come into play. But I feel like when it's strictly like a insult based on skin color, I feel like there's not as much of that like intersecting. I don't know. I guess I could see the argument that like a rich black person calling a poor white person a cracker, that could I wouldn't be upset by that because of the skin color part. I'd be upset by that because of the classist, like, wealth part of it, though, you know?
Yeah, and I don't necessarily disagree. But, like, depending on how we want to flip those arguments, we could probably find, you know, similarities on the other side of that, even if it seems kind of strange. Like, the N-word is obviously a really charged word in society, but like, you know, a group of white guys, you know, calling a black kid like the N-word is probably going to feel really fucking shitty for that kid. But you know, like a random white guy in the street, you know, some loser seeing Dave Chappelle saying, "Oh, you're an N-word," you know, Chappelle might feel like a little bit bad, but like at the end of the day, like he's fine, doesn't care that much. Like he's you know, he's doing way, way, way better than that guy, and it's probably not going to hit him in the same way as it would the other person. So I think when it comes down to like insults, I think that our individual engagement with and experiences of those systems are probably going to be more important than like the entire class we belong to, which is why I would say that if we're going to talk about racial slurs, it's probably just never a good idea to ever say it's defensible to attack somebody on the basis of like their skin color. Because it seems like when we start making arguments for that, we open ourselves up to so many weird worlds where like, can I go over to China and start calling a whole bunch of Chinese people racial slurs? Because technically in China, they have the systemic power that's like so much greater than mine. Or like if black people, or could I use racial slurs against Jewish people? Because like systemically, Jewish people are ahead of almost every group in the United States. But we would never really say that for those groups, right? Or I assume we wouldn't, right?
No, because, I mean, especially because of the histories of oppression. And yeah, I don't think that it would make sense to go to a different country and call them racial slurs if that group is a minority in the country that you came from. Yeah,
well, but but hold on. Does that really make sense? What if there was a black... I'm sure there are black countries in Africa where white people are a minority. But would those black people be able to come to the United States and then call white people a racial slur? Like, it just seems like a really weird like way to define like our engagement with racial slurs. Like, I think that academically we can like post hoc like construct these ways that slurs should or shouldn't work. But on an individual level, if somebody makes fun of you for the color of your skin, I think that's universally going to be kind of a shitty experience. Like, nobody's going to want that, I think. Which I think is great.
I think on an individual level, anytime you're insulting someone for the color of their skin is just like not like a smart or a good thing to do. It's just kind of dumb. But
I wouldn't say dumb. I'm saying bad, by the way. I want to take it a step further. It's probably bad, not just dumber, right?
Yeah, but you do like recognize that cracker and the N-word don't have the same, they aren't like on the same level, right?
Yeah, I agree with that. But I don't think anybody in the history of this entire conversation has ever made this argument. I see people pushing back against this a lot. Well, it's way worse to say the N-word. Yeah, of course it is. There's a reason why it's called the N-word. And to be fair, I don't know if that many people really care that much if they get called a cracker. The problem, though, is that if you can relentlessly shit on white people and then defend racial slurs against them, I do think you're going to run into problems there. Not you personally, I'm saying you generally. When you try to have conversations about like race or power or whatever with people that aren't 100% bought into your ideology, because now it just looks like an indefensible, impossible to defend position. Nobody's saying that the N-word and the C-word are the same thing in terms of badness, just that if you're going to decry one for being a racial slur and defend another that is a racial slur, you get into really weird territory there.
I understand on an individual level it can look like there's definitely some hypocrisy there, but like what would be your perspective on if someone wants to like relentlessly shit on someone for being short?
I think that there are really good arguments for that not being allowed either. Or rather, not being allowed, but that we should treat it pretty similarly. So like the policy that I had on my stream, and I'm not perfect with this, but the perspective that I had on my stream was that like, if we're going to attack somebody for something, if we're going to insult somebody for something, then that characteristic should be an innately bad thing, an intrinsically bad thing. So if I'm going to make fun of you for being a fascist, for being a Nazi, for being a tanky, if I'm going to make fun of you for that, it's because that thing is bad and you deserve to be made fun of for that thing. But I try to shun people away from making fun of people for being short or for fat or for being bald or whatever. Because like, okay, we don't really have control over this. Like, is it really like, do we want every single person that has that characteristic to feel attacked? You know, probably not. But that's kind of the way that I view it, yeah. And then in terms of, because sometimes when we have, oh yeah, go for it, yeah.
Yeah, I have the same perspective. If I'm calling someone out, if I'm making a commentary video about a white person, I'm not gonna be like, this dumb cracker, like that would be fucking stupid. I'm gonna criticize their ideas, not like,
yeah,
because yeah, I mean, making some fun of someone's immutable characteristic just has no like logical backing to it. It's literally you just being an asshole for no reason, you know.
I had I'm sure some people have had personal experiences with this. I had a really weird experience in high school, and it took me so long to figure out like what the fuck had even happened or how to understand this. But the group of people that I hung out with, there were a couple girls in this group of people that were pretty fat. And when I was going to high school, I'm 33 now, so when I was in high school, I graduated 2007. The fat acceptance stuff was like starting to kick into full swing, depending on like your group of people, and we were in a relatively progressive area. And it was so annoying because all the time, these girls would always make fun of me for being skinny. Because I was very, very, very skinny in high school. I weighed 100 pounds at like 5'8", very, very, very skinny. And I remember one day, she was making, this other girl, her name was Catherine, she was making a gay joke, something about like, or no, she wasn't making a gay joke. She was making a joke where she was like, oh, like, Brianna would never date you, her other friend. She's like, oh, she'd never date you because you're like a skinny little motherfucker. There's nothing to even grab. And my response was something along the lines of like, she would probably crush me because she's as fat as a fucking whale. And as soon as I said that, it was weird because the whole group of friends was okay with shitting on me for being skinny. But as soon as I said that, I was like, immediately, like, everybody looked at me like, what the fuck? It was hard for me intuitively to understand. It's like, what the fuck? Like, you guys have been making fun of my body weight the entire, like, for weeks. And when I make one comment, everybody's mad. This is bullshit. Now, even if we can argue from a systemic level, well, skinny people are less likely to face oppression than fat people, blah, 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 blah. An individual doesn't feel that way. I didn't feel like I had skinny privilege. Even if I did, I don't feel it. And then to have other people making fun of me for it, it's like, wait, what the fuck? This feels horrible. Yeah, go for it.
Well, and also when you shit on someone for being skinny, that is like still upholding like the body standards of like that it's okay to shame people for how their body is, when like my opinion is bodies are just vessels. Like, why the fuck would you even care what someone else's body looks like?
Sure.
But I would then argue, I would argue that like insulting people for being fat would probably do more harm on a systemic level than insulting someone for being skinny, because skinny is generally like the beauty standard. But I, as a fat person, you know, I'm not going to go around and insult people for being skinny, because, like, I do agree that there is a level of hypocrisy, and, like, we should be dismantling these stupid beauty standards, not, like, turn it the other way. But I do you see any legitimacy to the argument of, like, you know, like, if a gay person has been called the F slur, like, so many times, and they're just, like, so, like, dejected and angry about that them turning around and being like, shut up, like, straighty or something, you know, like, it's just out of the fact, like, it's not like a good thing to do, but just out of the fact that they've had to deal with so much shit, so they're like kind of a retaliation kind of thing, you know? I
mean, if you are going to make that concession, then you have to say that everybody has that ability to do that, right? Because, like, there are going to be people, depending on where you live, I don't know if it's politically correct to say that, there are going to be people who have had their shit stolen multiple times by black people. There are going to be people that have been raped by black people or beat up by black people. Is it okay for them to lash out and say the N-word? Like, I don't think we would ever say that's okay, no?
Well, I don't think it is, but I think the reason that it's not is because whenever you say that, it adds to the systemic issue.
Sure, so, but the question is, because on one end we want to say that somebody can't do something for academic issues, but then on the other end we want to justify somebody else's slur issues or slur justification for emotional issues. And what I'm saying is that, like, I don't think it's fair to have this ultra high emotional threshold on marginal class people, because they're just people. And if they have enough bad experiences with a certain type of person, they're going to want to say bad things about that type of person as well. It's interesting because you brought up something about I hate men earlier too. That's another thing where I notice it's super normal on the internet to be like, oh, I hate men. I had bad experiences with men, so fuck men. I hate all men. Fuck all men. And it's like, wait, what the fuck? This is like so weird that it's like this has become normalized and accepted now. And I think that there is harm being caused there. Maybe not a direct harm like racism in the, well, even today even, or racism in the past, but I do think there is harm being caused there when we have our conversations in that way.
Yeah, and well, my perspective has always been about like the hate all men or kill all men, especially when it like comes from like a white woman, is that like a white woman saying kill all men and then a black man hears that. It's like, okay, like, do you not understand that there are histories of like white women oppressing black men, and that just blanket saying kill all men could like hurt a black man if he hears that, or hurt a trans man, or hurt other marginalized. Like, you do have to take these intersectional identities into account. You can't just say like kill all of whatever.
Yeah. So I feel like it's probably better. And then also there's like what about like mixed race people? Like, are they affected by the term cracker at all? Or is it like, are we doing the one drop rule for slurs? Or it just seems like it's such a weird like, if I say you probably should never, or maybe there are comedy skits or whatever. I'm a free speech guy. There are funny jokes, okay? But like in general, we should never defend using slurs, racial slurs, as pejoratives at people. I think that's a pretty consistent thing, and I don't think I get into any trouble with that position. Like, I don't think somebody can be in a situation like, well, what about this, Destiny? Shouldn't you be able to say a racial slur there? Like, as a pejorative? No, I don't think so. But if we start doing like some are allowed and some aren't, there are so many weird areas we get in when it comes to like slurs for Jewish people, slurs for Chinese people in China, like mixed race people, what slurs are, like, it just gets so weird and crazy. And then individuals are going to be really unhappy, I think, with the results. Like, if a white person is unhappy being called cracker, I think that's fair. If somebody's unhappy because they can't use a racial slur at somebody, I don't think that that's as fair. I don't really give as much credence to their emotion there.
I think... Oh, what was I going to say? I think if you really legitimately do have the perspective that any slur against anyone making fun of any immutable characteristic like hair color, eye color, short, tall, fat, skinny, if you think that that's like all bad and all not okay, then I do think you are being like morally consistent as far as like, then yeah, making fun of white people wouldn't be okay. I just feel like it does feel like some white people are getting like really up in arms about the whole like people making fun of them for being white, but then not having that same like perspective as far as like making fun of fat people or making fun of, short people or whatever,
Well, I mean, it does seem societally that we do tend to place racial pejoratives into different boxes, even though I don't know if we should or shouldn't, but we do tend to put those, we elevate those above all else, right? Like, we can have somebody being bullied relentlessly for being, my go-to example is usually fat. I'm not trying to insult you or anything. But like the go-to is that like that can cause a ton of harm to a person and is like super normalized throughout all of society and in movies and everything, that's fine. But like calling somebody a racial slur is like the holy grail of like horrible shit. But it seems a little bit strange that we focus on one thing but not the other thing, So well, I do agree that it seems a little like hypocritical there, but I mean, that just seems to be the way society is,
But I think that's because of the history of racism as opposed to like the history of fat phobia, because historically black people were a lot more oppressed than fat people, so that...
Maybe.
You don't agree with that?
Historically, if we were talking about like slavery and shit, absolutely. But like in the past like 20 years, I think you can have, there's a lot of legitimate conversations to have there. Because, oh man, in the world that I live in, like pretty privilege is a very real thing. And that is something that I can see that impacts people's lives in an unbelievable way. I don't know. It's a harder one. Maybe not worth arguing about here, but yeah.
I agree that once you're getting into like arguments of quantifying oppression, then it's like, well, that gets pretty like subjective, and how can you even do that,
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I guess for my so I guess what I would ask you is, as far as like terms of service on websites go, like what would you say would be the line as far as like, do you think if you're a freedom of speech guy, would you be in favor of banning any and all slurs. Like, if someone calls someone else short, then they can get banned off of Twitch? Or, like, what is your perspective on that?
I go way in the other direction. For TOS, I don't care about like slurs or hate speech or whatever. I think if you don't like somebody, just block them. The only thing I really care about, I do politics a lot. I don't like misinformation. That's the only thing I would ban for. But that gets into a whole other weird area. But if you are going to have a TOS that enforces some things, like if you can't make fun of somebody's skin color, then I think all racial slurs kind of have to be off the table, at least when used as pejoratives. You just can't let some and not the others. It just makes such a weird world where people are going to feel really upset. I think justifiably so.
Yeah. I guess my perspective is that you still do have to weigh, like, how harsh one is or the other is. But I do understand that with terms of service, if your rule is, like, don't make fun of someone for the color of their skin, then you would have to uphold that across the board. Otherwise, like, it does get into, like, really complicated issues, especially when it's like not just white people and black people, but like all the different races, and you know, then it gets very muddy very quickly.
Yeah, or different races being like another good one, especially because Hassan is Turkish, right? Like, can Armenians call Turkish people racial slurs because of past genocidal things? Or could, you know, we want to talk about like a history of Jewish people. What about Palestinians? Can Palestinians call Israelis or Jewish people in general like racial slurs? Like making like you mentioned it earlier, like this hierarchy of slurs gets very, very weird very quickly, you know?
Yeah. Like if a Palestinian person is being like actively kicked out of their home or something, then I would say like, I don't know. But in general, I don't think any person should ever like call someone a slur out of like thinking that you're actually like superior to the person or whatever.
This is kind of like, it broadly informs, or this is a broader topic, but it informs this conversation. And I'm just kind of curious what you think about it. One of the issues that I have here is that I think that there is a feeling among a lot of certain types of white people in the United States that like white people are under attack. I think that's been a feeling for a little bit, for a variety of reasons. Now, 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said that like, this is kind of ridiculous. You're being very fragile. You know, the concept of white fragility comes up. But I start to empathize more and more with people depending on what goes on. And that's kind of why I push back on some of these topics now. So for instance, I think that January 6th was a really, really horrible event. You're familiar with like the White House thing and everything, the protest. Yeah. I think it was really, really, really horrible. But I think it's really bad if you are not willing to condemn the BLM riots as well. Because there are communities that are still to this day destroyed in the United States as a result of some of those riots. You can go to Kenosha or Minnesota or even Seattle, and there are still businesses that are boarded up and down streets that are just never going to come back. And the damage is still seen today. And when you're constantly being told like, well, this is a BLM, it's not for you to worry about, like there's systemic oppression, you don't understand, you're white, blah, 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 blah. I start to empathize with people that feel like, well, fuck, it kind of does feel like we're under attack. And I think it's good to push back in the easy areas to maybe alleviate that feeling a little bit. So like if that is the consensus in the United States, maybe it's okay to say, okay, well, let's at least not call white people racial slurs to kind of alleviate that feeling rather than like leaning into that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I would again, I feel like my philosophy is always like to simultaneously view it on an individual and a systemic level. Because like on an individual level, I would say burning a building down is always bad. But on a systemic level, I'm going to have more empathy for a riot that was brought out of, you know, systemic injustice against black people than a riot that was brought out of misinformation about a stolen election, you know?
Yeah, but like how do the individuals in a neighborhood feel about that?
And that's why I'm saying on an individual level, I say burning a building is always bad because the people in a certain neighborhood aren't going to say, oh, it's fine that you destroyed my business because you were doing it for a good cause. You know, like that doesn't really work on an individual level.
But even just hearing you say that though, like again, the class of white people are never going to hear a message because classes don't hear messages. Individuals do. I don't think there's any individual in an affected community that will ever be receptive to that kind of message. That's my issue, I guess. Like class-wise, I probably mostly agree with what you're saying. But individual-wise, and these are the only units of society that exist are individuals, right? These are what hear the messages. That's always going to sound so unbelievably condescending I guess, or maybe on the flip side, even maybe privileged, right? This the privileged take of like the white liberal that lives in a gated community, is able to speak about these things because his community wasn't the one that was burned down. And I think that's the kind of stuff that we probably have to avoid.
Yeah, I mean, I don't condone burning down buildings, like, no matter who is doing it, like I said.
Okay.
So,
Because it sounded like the way that you phrased it a little bit was like, well, I understand, I'm sympathetic to riots that happen in response to certain conditions. And it's like, okay, but like, do we have the same sympathies for the people whose neighborhoods were burned down? Because nationwide, I'd say the answer is absolutely not. That sympathy was not there. Those people, I would say, were demonized. So that's kind of my worry, my issue. And then the white cracker word kind of just plays into all of that.
Mm-hmm. I think I can have more sympathy for one thing over another thing while still condemning both things,
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Because I think breaking into the Capitol building and like threatening to overthrow the government is probably going to do more harm on like a systemic level, but then burning down someone's small business is going to do more harm on an individual level. So
Sure. Okay, well.
Yeah, I don't know necessarily like how much we disagree on things. I just feel like a lot of the takes on this have been kind of like annoying on both sides, like saying it's not a slur, or like I mean, I guess if you're saying no one is trying to say that they're the same, you're just saying they're both bad, basically.
Well, I'm not even saying they're both bad. I'm saying they're both racial slurs.
Yeah,
that's all I'm saying.
I would agree that they're both racial slurs because you're insulting someone for their race.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that you should analyze systems and history when you come to analyze these things, because I don't think a gay person calling someone a straighty is going to have the same harm as a straight person calling someone the F slur,
Sure, but again,
we
keep going back to we should analyze systems, but we would never expect an individual to do this ever, would we?
I think you would expect individuals to... I mean, I would expect individuals to have like a basic understanding of how the systems of power work.
Well, let's say hypothetically, let's say that you had a white man whose car had been broken into a few times by black people. Do you think that white man is justified in being afraid or not liking black people?
No.
Okay, let's say that you had a white woman that's been raped by a black person. Do you think that she has a right to feel uncomfortable around black people? Or is that just her being irrational and she's not allowed to have that feeling? This is where I think like these conversations get like really challenging, because it seems like we're expecting a lot emotionally out of one group of people. But if we use this term of like, well, if you suffered enough under one group, you can have bad feelings about them. I feel like I can find lots of examples of people that have suffered under minority power groups, but we probably wouldn't want to say, well, it's okay for them to be racist, or expect other people to always have like this kind of like detached, godlike understanding of their emotional response. And instead understand like, well, we're all humans. We all are pretty emotional sometimes. Like maybe we should just avoid this whole thing, full stop. That's kind of how I view it.
Yeah, but I feel like emotional responses, when they are like contributing to oppression, are different than emotional responses like in response to oppression, Yeah,
I don't know, but I understand academically, but I just don't think intuitively as a human, I just don't think we don't, our emotions don't usually work that way, right? Like, I don't think we think emotionally like, let's say a white person breaks in my car and steals shit, and then a black person breaks in my car. I don't think we ever feel like, man, the white person doing this is really bad. The black person doing it is bad too, but I don't feel quite as bad because I understand that black people as a class of people are a little bit more oppressed than my class, right? I don't think individually any of us ever feel this way about things. It's always like academic. Or our justification that we're using is academic, but our feelings individually are always like emotional. That's what it feels like to me.
Yeah, I mean, if I parked in like an underprivileged neighborhood and my car was broken into, no matter who fucking broke into my car, I would be really pissed off about it. But I can still analyze things on a systemic level and realize that like there are systemic issues that lead to higher rates of crime in that neighborhood, and that the higher rates of crime are being caused by, possible oppression in the past. Does that mean on an individual level I'm going to be like, oh, that's great, that's totally fine that you broke into my car? No, of course not. I'm going to be fucking pissed off out of my mind, but I can still have that systemic analysis. I kind of feel like you're like downplaying people's ability to like analyze systems.
Absolutely. I think that people are very emotional, and I think that people are very heuristic when it comes to understanding the world. So like we see a few events and then we make a pattern, and that's kind of how we understand things. I think that all people do that. White people, black people, every men, women. So I think that being aware of that is really important, because I don't think anybody's like sociological understanding is going to help them overcome some individual like emotional experience. Like maybe intellectually you can reflect upon it later, but in any particular point in time, I think eventually like these emotional things are just like, as humans, we just kind of process things this way. This way. Because like, even if I were to take this farther, like if people were capable of being these like sociological machines, then like no person should ever say a racial slur or a homophobic slur or a straight slur or anything, because like, because they should just know like, oh, well, slurs are bad. Like even if a gay guy gets beat up over and over again by straight people for being gay and they all call him the F slur, he should realize, okay, sure, I don't like straight people because of this, but I'm not going to say a slur because I understand that it contributes to a negative environment where other slurs become permissible. Right? He's not going to have that emotional experience. He's going to hate fucking straight people that beat him up or that look like people that beat him up.
But I feel, isn't that like part of maturing as a person, to be able to learn to analyze things in that way and to be able to learn how to control your emotional responses? Because you can't control your emotions. If someone does something horrible to you, you're going to get angry, you're going to get sad, but part of maturing as a person is learning how to control and not lash out and like hit someone because you're angry, or not like call someone something because you're angry, you know?
Are you, this is a totally random question you have to answer now. Wait, how old are you? Just curious about.
I'm 24.
Okay, so you're pretty old. I don't think the average person is capable of doing that. Or if maybe they are, but they would have to be like in deliberate environments to do it. I think by far.
You don't think someone can like control their emotions and not like hit a person?
I think they could, but I think it's far more likely that people are pretty emotionally impulsive, and that people tend to form predictable responses to predictable environments or sets of circumstances. And I would rely on that a million times over than anything else. Like, attacking people is illegal and is wrong, and is more wrong than calling somebody a racial slur every time. Calling somebody a racial slur is not as bad as like attacking somebody. Sorry, excuse me. But if I
think I would agree with that.
Sure. But if I go up and down the streets of fucking LA and I start looking for black people and I start screaming the N-word at them, I would expect that most of the time I'm gonna get my ass kicked. Almost every time. Or at very least like 70% plus, I'm gonna get my ass kicked. Now, is that because I think black people are animals and can't control their emotions and they're not smart enough? No. I just think that in general, I think that people are pretty predictable. They have emotional response to things, and that's just how people work. That's my view of the world, basically, yeah.
I guess maybe that... I don't know if you can be like prescriptive and say that that's just like how people innately are. I think that's like... I feel like that's one of the reasons you should go to like therapy and try to like improve yourself so that you can control those negative responses. Because I feel like one of the things that shows who you truly are as a person is how you lash out when you're angry or when you're feeling a negative emotion, you know, because
I agree.
Like everyone is going to, you know, most people are going to be reasonable when they're not pissed off, but what shows your integrity is like how you act when you are fucking pissed off, you know?
Yeah, I agree 1,000,000%. But I don't think most people have the same perspective, or they'll say they do, but they won't actually, like, they won't do it. Like, could you imagine getting like a 45, 50-year-old person to go to therapy because they have like negative feelings about black people? Because maybe when they were younger, they heard bad things or had some bad experiences. Like, I just don't see that happening with most people.
Well, maybe not, but I mean, that's why I feel like we should, you know, keep educating the youth to have more emotional intelligence so that we can keep improving that as time goes on, you know?
Well, yeah, and we can definitely do that. But I think in the meantime, and maybe all the time, to make things easier for everybody, it probably makes everybody feel better if we just say, okay, guys, racial slurs are bad. We probably shouldn't say racial slurs, rather than treating everybody today as though they have these perfect sociological understandings of why some slurs might be okay and some slurs aren't.
Yeah, I think I can agree that on an individual level, like, I don't think in a classroom, like a teacher should sit down and be like, hey kids, guess what? If you're white, don't call anyone a slur, but black people should call the white students in the class slurs. Like, obviously not, you know, but like,
Do you know who
I
Brett
feel
Weinstein is?
who?
Brett Weinstein?
I know Harvey Weinstein. I don't know if I know Brett Weinstein.
You probably do. I don't know how much you follow politics, but he's like he's been on Joe Rogan a few times. He has like a podcast where they talk about like the vaccines and shit. He's like a big, like, I don't know how I'd characterize him, like anti-SJW kind of conspiracy theory guy, kind of weird. But his existence was spun into reality because of a really fucking weird event that happened at his university, where all of the black kids, well, I guess some of the white kids, decided that for one day, no white people should be allowed to go to school, in remembrance of like when black people weren't allowed to attend white universities. And that's a pretty weird thing, to force all the white people not to go to school. And he disagreed with that, and I think he emailed somebody about it, and it blew up into such a huge issue. I think he got fired over it. And this is how he's like a big conservative celebrity figure now or whatever. And I disagree with everything he says today, and I think that guy's a fucking moron. But his villain background story, I'm very sympathetic to. I don't know how I would feel. If I was in a university and people were like, oh, no white people going to school today. I'd be like, wait a second, what the fuck? That's really, really, really strange. I don't think I agree with that at all. It just doesn't feel good, you know?
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out where, like, what my perspective is on this sort of issue. Like, the fine line between, like, safe spaces as opposed to, like, segregation. Like, like, what's the difference between a safe space and segregation, and how do you, like, deal with that? And I feel like in a university where everyone is paying to attend university, it doesn't make sense that you would be able to like tell people that they shouldn't come to school on a certain day. Now, I don't necessarily agree that a negative experience like that would be enough to like have a villain backstory and be like, I hate black people now because they did this one thing this one time that was rude to me, you know.
And I would agree, but this kind of goes back to that conversation where it's like this informs the other conversation. That feels like it's starting to become like a running narrative where I remember when I was growing up, my mom, so my mom came over from Cuba when she was 5, and Cubans are very, very, very conservative. Holy fuck, my whole family is like ride or die Trump supporters, which is obnoxious as fuck. But I remember we argued all the time as kids, or when I became like an adolescent, I don't know, it was like 15, 16. We started to argue more because I started to become more left, and she always would tell me, Stevie, you don't understand, like liberals, Democrats, they hate America. That's all they want. They hate America. They hate America. And it's like, damn, Mom, I don't think they hate America. They just feel a little bit differently about how we should fix our problems. But today, I would say at the very least for the progressive wing, and then for lefties online, it's like socialists and communists, I think a lot of their politics are just broadly informed by hating America, or sometimes hating white people, where it's like, oh, fuck white people, fuck America. And then that's kind of like all you have to really say for everybody to kind of like turn around and clap. And I think that's becoming more and more pervasive. And I can understand people feeling threatened by that and then having really negative responses to that. I totally understand that.
Yeah, I think, like, I would consider myself a lefty, but I wouldn't say I hate America. I would say I hate, like, imperialism, I hate colonialism, you know, like, I hate negative things that America has participated in, but I wouldn't say that I, like, hate America, because I feel like that's not really productive at all, you know?
Sure.
And something that I'll say, I totally disagree with Hassan's take of, like, that you should be able to call Cuban people I don't even know if I should say it, the G word or whatever.
It just means worm, yeah.
Yeah, like, his take of, like, white people should be able to call Cuban people that word just because they're conservatives. Like, what a fucking insane... Like, I thought that was, like, a horrible take from Hassan, honestly.
Yeah, well, anything else you want to talk about?
No, not necessarily. I appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk these things out with me, man.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, I agree with you that it does feel like there are less and less conversations happening between like the right and the left these days, and it feels like people can't sit down and sort of like hash things out. So I just thought, you know, maybe we could have a conversation through this, and I appreciate you taking the time to do it.
Yeah, no problem. Well, hey, have fun, stay safe, be careful.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm Mr. Beard on YouTube if anyone wants to check me out. So
Is that like a meme or?
it's
you're
it's
called-
it's my last name, and I like to just confuse people because they're like, "Why the fuck don't you have a beard?"
Your last name is Beard or your last name is Mr. Beard?
No, my last name is Beard. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
All right,
well
man.
done.
Well, have a good one, man.
Yeah, have a good one.